The 23rd edition of the World Economic Forum served as a platform for economic conversation and deliberation, including the launch of the 2013 Africa Competitiveness Report. Themed Connecting Africa's Markets in a Sustainable Way, the report was jointly produced by the African Development Bank, the World Bank and the World Economic Forum and maps out the key policy challenges in Africa that impede the continent's ability to raise its competitiveness both regionally and globally.
We need to improve Africa's competitiveness. We know what the drivers are for doing that, such as infrastructure investment, such as investing in people, in education, such as dealing with some of the social issues, improving the business climate right across Africa, harnessing the natural resources that Africa has got. We know what to do. So competitiveness is at the core of making sure that Africa's promise is indeed realized.
According to the report, Africa's infrastructure deficit presents a serious impediment to regional integration, a problem that is made more pronounced by growth in consumer markets and urbanization. The regional import and export of goods, including agriculture produce and key resources, is an area blighted by less than adequate infrastructure on the continent.
Recent report that the World Bank did on agribusiness, which is one of the inputs into the Africa Competitiveness Report, highlights that Africa imports about $25 billion worth of foodstuffs, of which only $1 billion comes from other African countries. So the barriers within Africa seem to be higher than between Africa and the rest of the world. And so this is a key area of focus to work on over the next decade.
The movement of people also remains a challenge.
All those things, infrastructure, the fact that our border posts don't work well, trucks takes 2 days to cross the border while they're trying to get raw material for manufacturing into the next country. It's about the administration, the inefficient port handling facilities. It's about, these are intangible barriers, so to say. All those things need to be fixed, frankly, for Africa to integrate better. I mean, we were talking earlier about the issue of exports to Europe first, then back to Africa. How about just movement of people? It took me 2 days to move from Tunis to Cape Town because I had to fly to Paris. And then, of course, then from Paris, I had a direct flight, luckily, to Johannesburg, and then eventually to Cape Town. So that the fact that I couldn't fly directly from Tunis to Cape Town is a problem. So getting movement of people going through aviation infrastructure is part of getting integration going in the first place.
Given the crucial role that infrastructure in Africa's transformation, both socially and economically, delegates across the board acknowledge that although there has been substantial progress, even more remains to be done.
There's been a lot of progress. The African Development Bank initiated a program for infrastructure development in Africa, PIDA, and it's pretty comprehensive. But merely having a comprehensive dossier doesn't automatically translate. The World Economic Forum has come to the party with some other agencies, and this has now been taken forward, and there's been some project selection. And so suddenly what sits in a big file looks like it has a lot more life and a lot more chance of survival. Just bringing in a different strand into that, 3 years ago, heads of state at the AU agreed to drive infrastructure, and President Zuma coordinates that presidential initiative. So all of this comes together, and the coming together is right now.
In so many instances, we just don't have the infrastructure that's required to really support these economies. And at the end of the day, it's a question of putting down the infrastructure that's required and not so much even about necessarily coming down to the best practice, cost of it. So from an investor's perspective, it's a very good time to be in the field. From a government perspective, there's a huge realization that, the challenge is so big that they cannot do everything, right? And where private capital is willing to come in and participate, I think that's obviously very welcome. Now, it's not in every single infrastructure opportunity that private capital will be best placed. There's a lot of, what I don't really like the term, but what people term as social infrastructure. Obviously, that's also critical. But it's a space that has a lot of growth, has very good stable yields, and has a very good long-term horizon, which is what every investor is looking for.
From an investment perspective, Africa's infrastructure sector has garnered increased attention from the BRIC nations.
If you see last 7 to 8 years, the total investment from BRICS country has been almost more than $30 to $35 billion, because India itself has invested around $8.5 billion in last 5 to 7 countries. Further, India has a program of giving $1 billion per year to Africa, and they made a specific plan of $5 billion, which was announced in Maputo in Ethiopia by the Prime Minister of India. China has almost committed the project worth $30 billion in different parts of Africa. Brazil is very active now, coming into railway of Ethiopia, Mozambique. They have been last 3 years working. So what I think next 5 to 10 years from BRICS country, I think between $50 to $75 billion investment, because they are the major player nowadays in Africa infrastructure.
The Africa Competitiveness Report is one of the most anticipated releases of the meeting, however. As with the majority of academic releases, its true value will lie in the ability of Africa's policymakers to apply the findings to their regional economies.
Oh yes, absolutely. There's a buy-in from the African leadership to make sure that infrastructure is at the core of getting Africa moving to realize its promise, but also all those other indicators which are in the competitiveness report in the first place in terms of how countries are ranked. There's commitment across the board there. The issue is how to finance it, but the leadership is committed in my view. And certainly institutions such as the African Development Bank, where we are behind a lot of these initiatives to make sure that it happens. I think it's fair to say that the global financial crisis and the economic crisis thereof is presenting a great opportunity for Africa, because this excess liquidity you see globally from quantitative easing is looking for a home, in my view, and that home is not Europe, because there are no yields. In my view, the home is Africa. So how do we harness that for financing Africa's growth? That's a challenge for us in Africa to think about and come up with the right instruments to make that happen.
Africa's bright future will be in part driven by foreign direct investment in resources, as well as emerging key industries such as banking and telecoms. However, the true key to delivering on African economic promise is greater cooperation between the states on the continents.
High level of consensus that I'm detecting that the African continent has got to place itself on a new growth path if we're going to consolidate this very, very positive period that we're now in, of optimism based on a growth performance that's been quite outstanding over the last few years. And that new growth path has got to be based on industrialization. And if we look at emerging economies and peer countries in BRICS, we see that they are all turning to their domestic markets. So the problem we have as Africa is colonialism divided us into 54 different countries, and we have to find a basis for industrial development based on regional integration, and particularly on broadening regional integration beyond the existing regional communities.
If you look at the tripartite alliance that was formed between 3 regional economic communities, SADC, COMESA-E and EAC, in harmonizing those 26 countries that belong to those RECs, you will have an excess of a population of 600 million people with a GDP of $1 trillion. So the market potential of harmonizing efforts between these 3 regions is critical to the success of Africa. And this cuts across the board. There are 3 focus areas that are being identified there and being worked on. One of them is industrialization. How do we grow more businesses and generate economies in those regions? The second is harmonization of policies on trade, etc., and movement of goods. And the third is obviously on infrastructure, which has been highlighted as one of the big constraints to Africa's growth.
With almost 1,000 delegates from across all spheres of business, government and civil society in attendance, this year's World Economic Forum on Africa has proved to be the most successful yet. And as the continent ponders about the strategies needed to meet the goals set out at this year's forum, the West African nation of Nigeria is putting its plans in motion to host the rest of Africa and the world in 2014.